Greetings. This is the Executive Director for the International Council for Small Business and Deputy Chair of the Department of Management at the George Washington University. My name is Ayman Tarabishi, and we'll start in 10 seconds. Greetings again. This is the ICSB Exchange webinar. I am delighted to be here today with all of you. And on this session for today, we'll be introducing our brand new journal of the International Council for Small Business. And I'm honored and delighted to have Dr. Jeffrey Alves, Managing Editor of the new journal of the International Council for Small Business, and also Mr. Thomas Conway, Portfolio Development of Taylor & Francis Group, which is the publisher of our journal. Dr. Jeffrey Alves, greetings. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. And yourself?
Doing very well. It's a nice weather here today, and it's a great day for small businesses around the world. A lot of governments are going in for full support, so we're just delighted. If you go to the ICSB website, we made just a major announcement today about supporting the new act that the Senate has passed, and hopefully the U.S. Congress will pass all of it, and also what is going on in Europe and Asia and the Middle East and Africa. So this is a good day for small businesses. And Mr. Conway, greetings. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much. Really excited to be invited to the call and kind of express how excited we are about publishing the Journal of the International Council for Small Business and working with the ICSP.
Fantastic. So why don't we go ahead and start? What we'll do is, let me just go to the next slide. And what we'll do is you'll present the slide, and then we'll go from there. And let me give you the agenda for the day. First of all, I just did a brief introduction, but what I'll do next is ask Dr. Jeffrey Alves to go through why this new journal, ask Tom to come in and talk about our relationship, our partnership with Taylor & Francis, and talk a little bit and get into more depth about the JICSB philosophy and focus, and also kind of what are available for authors or potential authors in terms of interface and resources. And then we'll wrap it up, and we'll leave some extra time here for all our partners to come in and ask some questions. So on the right-hand side, everybody, you'll see a little question or chat box where you can put in some questions here, and we have some exciting news to also share at the end here. So why don't we go ahead and start? Jeff, you can just tell me next slide, and I'll move it.
Next slide.
Here we go.
Okay, ICSB is a fairly old organization, founded in 1955. Today, its membership is global, and traditionally we've focused on entrepreneurship and MSMEs. In recent years, we've tended to ignore. Well, in earlier years, we tended to ignore the small business aspect of our mission. And you can see that we have 4 pillars for the organization: researchers, policymakers, practitioners, and educators. And the mission overall for ICSB is to advance the understanding of entrepreneurship and small business issues. And from a traditional perspective, we've tended to focus on the entrepreneurship side more than the small business side, and yet MSMEs are a significant contributor to the overall economies of most nations, as you can see by the statistics that are listed here. Next slide. We have, since about 2012, 2013, decided that our strategy moving forward for the organization was to pick up where we felt we had not spent enough time, and that was with the area of policy and at the practitioner level. And to do that, we recognized that we couldn't do it by ourselves, and so we very consciously reached out to a number of organizations globally to help us expand the knowledge and delivery of knowledge to not just policymakers and practitioners, but ultimately to the small business community. And so, for example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and Andrew McDonald is a perfect example of an organization at the practitioner level that is lifting and helping small businesses to improve their performance. The World Bank, United Nations, particularly UNCTAD, with its focus on the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, has been an incredibly important partner. The American Development Bank, the International Labor Organization, which we'll mention a little bit later, the International Finance Corporation, and the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, are all very, very important partners. In 2012, 2013, the ICSB updated its strategy, and one of the things that we said was that we wanted to be at the table where we could share knowledge and the resources from a 5,000 member organization dealing with micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises to help improve their performance and sustainability ultimately. Next slide, please. So traditionally, or in the past, we've hasn't really focused on the United Nations development goals. And yet, as we began talking with the United Nations, we realized that these 17 Sustainable Development Goals that grew out of the 2015 Millennial Development Goals were really very much part of the development of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. In fact, if you look at the 17, you'll note that at least 13 of the 17 directly can be impacted by the performance and sustainability of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And in fact, all 17 are at least indirectly impacted. Next slide, please. One of our earliest supporters was Ambassador Ojund, the president of the Economic and Social Council at the United Nations. This was the organization that ICSB approached 4 years ago to try to engage and share what we could do as an organization with the overall United Nations objectives and goals. And Ambassador Anjun was really supportive of what we were trying to do, and ultimately was a key player in the establishment of the United Nations Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Enterprise Day, which I'll mention a little bit later. Next slide, please. So several years ago, ICSB, with the help of Ambassador Anjun, brought together a number of people, a number of key people at the United Nations to talk about the importance and relevance of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And in many respects, this conclave, if you will, this conference was really the focus and the impetus for the upgrading the discussion of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises to an international level. Now, ICSB had been involved and had been working towards coming to these sorts of platforms and tables. We had very fortunately been invited to be an observer for the Organization of Economic Development's Working Party for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises and Entrepreneurship Working Party, and that was a multi-year effort to be able to participate in their deliberations and their research, and help have an input into the way it was going. The United Nations was a huge step up, however. Next step. So in 2016, the ICSB actually held its annual conference in New York with the support of the United Nations. In fact, we held our conference opening at the United Nations. There was a ministerial roundtable discussion, and we introduced the ICSB MSME and Humane Entrepreneurship Knowledge Forum at this particular event. It was a tremendously well turned out event. Participants came from over 55 countries and established the stage and the recognition that ICSB can have a role to play in sharing knowledge at the policy and practitioner level. Next slide, please. So in 2017, with the help of Ambassador Garcia Montron from Argentina, who was the lead sponsor of a resolution for creating the United Nations Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Enterprise Day, the resolution was presented to the General Assembly and ultimately passed. The impetus for this and the driving force behind this, credit has to go to Dr. Ayman Tarabishi, who spent hours and days lobbying for support. The resolution was passed in September of 2015, and it became an incredibly important focal point and for discussing MSMEs globally, and we've managed to celebrate MSME Day, United Nations MSME Day, every year since at the United Nations. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the charter was for the United Nations was signed on the 26th of June, and when we were actually asked what date we wanted MSME Day, Dr. Tarabishi immediately said, well, let's do the 27th, the day after the United Nations. And so the charter was signed. And so now and forevermore, June the 27th is the United Nations MSME Day. And ICSB intends to celebrate that at the United Nations every year moving forward as part of our agenda supporting micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Next slide, please. First ever global report on MSMEs with the UN, OECD, and ILO, and over 8 countries reporting was published last year in June of 2019. This is a publication that ICSB intends to keep up annually with the idea of increasing its coverage and making it more relevant, not just on a global and policy level, but also to the countries that are participating in the report itself. This is a major undertaking for the organization and fits very nicely, in fact, with the advent of the Journal of the International Council for Small Business. Next slide, please. And here we have yours truly signing the declaration. In the background, we can see Dr. Terabishi and his wife. And next slide. So I mentioned 2012, 2013, ICSB took a look at where we were and where we could go. We recognized that we had traditionally had a heavier emphasis on research and educators, two of the four pillars for ICSB. And this was reflected to a large part by the success of the Journal of Small Business Management, as well as a number of ICSB affiliates. But we recognized that policymakers and practitioners were not being particularly well served. And given the resources, given the talent, given the intellectual power of the membership of ICSB, we felt that we could make a more tangible contribution to not just entrepreneurship, but the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise population globally, by helping to provide policymakers with data and information that would inform their decisions, and ultimately help practitioners deliver services that would help improve or lift the performance and sustainability of our micro and small enterprise population globally. Next. So in an effort to move towards that objective, we began including more policy speakers at our conferences. We actually run additional conferences during the year that focuses more on policy and practitioners. We, as I mentioned before, became an official observer of the OECD WPS MEE working group and the United Nations Micro, Small, and Medium-Sized Enterprise Day. All significant accomplishments that have occurred since about 2012, 2013 for ICSB. Next slide, please. And at this point, let me turn it over to Tom to talk about why we're working with them to publish the Journal of the International Council for Small Business.
Thank you very much for that, Jeff, and thanks to Iman as well for the introduction a bit earlier. As was mentioned, my name is Tom Conway. I run the portfolio development for the business and management list at Routledge, Taylor and Francis. So what does that mean? It means I grow the list, and I'm in charge of kind of working on new projects in the journals area of management and business. And as kind of Jeff gave an overview in terms of the ICSB, their background, and why there really was a need, an imperative to launch JICSB, I'm going to give a quick run through in terms of why Taylor and Francis is so excited to be on board with this project and why we see it aligning with the global publishing trends that we work in every day. So I'll work through this, and as mentioned a bit earlier, happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. So there's a couple key components to this. The first bit is publishing is a global proposition these days, right? And JICSB is positioned to succeed in that global landscape. What does global really mean? You know, gone are the days where a journal could be set up and it's a broad topic and it might be based in the US or the UK and it'll kind of succeed in different markets, right? Today, there needs to be engagement from researchers across the globe at every level of the publication. It's not just based on readership, right? So what does that mean? One, that means an international conversation that's taking place by way of the authors, right? So you have contributors. Two, that means people working on the journal that are from, you know, different geographies and slightly different backgrounds in terms of working on MSMEs, right? So you're talking about editorial board members, editors, things like that. And then 3, it means reviewers, right? Because they're a significant part of the conversation today. I'm going to run through some numbers really quick about why JICSB is positioned to do that very successfully and why we're so excited to get on board. So number 1 is there's a couple of key markets that are really on the rise, and some have already been on the rise for a significant period of time in terms of research output and engagement with journals, right? The one most people might be aware of is China, which is really a powerhouse in terms of research alongside the US. When you think about MSME research and the work the ICSB has done, that Jeff has gone through, it's really in good shape to capture China and the authors, the reviewers as part of the MSME conversation globally. A couple other markets I mentioned that I know the journal is well positioned in. Turkey, for example, is an emerging market in terms of reviewers and authors participating in the journal conversation. South Korea as well has seen exponential growth in recent years. And just through some of the background that Jeff and I just ran through, you can see that that's very much in the spirit of the MSME Day, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I should mention Egypt also as a really key up-and-comer in terms of the entrepreneurship, but really just a broader business and management research community. So a couple of things I'll mention there. Number 2 is mentioned a couple of times by Jeff, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Those are important in and of themselves, as Jeff just went through. But from Taylor and Francis' perspective, we really thought it was a novel kind of breakthrough idea to base a journal around not just kind of some theoretical topics or research areas, but to base it really around goals, right, and achieving certain things and fixing certain problems. And the UN SDGs are kind of baked into the aims and scope of JISP, right, of JICSB. And we think kind of in the 21st century publishing landscape, research based around problems, ideas, solutions is where publishing is going versus just broad areas that could be kind of theoretical and out there, right? And JICSB is certainly positioned to deliver on that. As an organization, we've put some investment in publishing more research to deliver on the SDGs, and we've been compiling that research across all of our publications for a couple of years now to make it available to folks on a global scale. So that certainly fit in with our long-term strategy as an organization. And again, I think the value speaks for itself. The third bit here, JISP is set up to succeed where publishing is going, right? When I talk about that future publishing landscape, what I'm really talking about is open access. It's not an open access journal, but it's positioned to be strong in that area. What does open access mean? It's when research is freely available, so there's maximized impact, engagement with policy organizations, engagement with practitioner organizations, those various pillars that Jeff just talked about. It is the key growth area in publishing right now. And particularly in business management, open access articles are up 40% in 2019 versus 2018. So to some degree, that's where the journal's landscape is going. And because of the policy engagement, the grounding in the SDGs, and the partner network that the ICSB has, this journal is positioned to succeed in that kind of landscape. So that's where publishing is going, and JISP is very well positioned to go there. Next slide. I just wanted to work through a quick example of what the convergence of all of this looks like in the early days of the journal from our perspective. Now, I mentioned where publishing is going, and a lot of that is driven by the policymakers, the practitioners, but a lot of you on this call might have sensed that at the university level, there's been a real shift to prioritizing that real world impact of research and engagement in those policy practice communities, right? So a couple of weeks ago now, we organized in joint with the ICSB and with the JICSB editorial team, a social media chat that will bring together people from different areas to discuss International Women's Day and the themes of, okay, women in business, supporting Women's Day. And we brought together industry experts, but also researchers. And there's really only a handful of journals that can really pull that off, right? And the influential panel kind of dug into women entrepreneurship, economic well-being. The headliner from JICSB's perspective was Chantaline Carpentier from UNCTAD, who Jeff mentioned a bit earlier. from the UN to kind of drive that conversation forward with some of our more academically oriented research economics editors for economic research. So it really was a really high level conversation. I'd encourage anyone to take a look on the ICSB's Twitter page and see what it was all about. But that really exemplifies how this journal could be a bridge and work between these different areas of the spectrum on MSME research. Next slide. And I think this is back over to Jeff to pick this up.
Okay, we've got a mission statement that's fairly lengthy and comprehensive, but in short, the objective and the mission of the journal is to share knowledge that will improve the performance and sustainability of MSMEs globally. And basically what we're talking about is moving research and making research available to the policymakers who can then create policies, implement policies that are useful to both practitioners and to the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise population. Recognizing that as we look around the world, the MSME family, if you will, is very, very different in many countries. You know, we've got developing countries, we've got developed countries, we've got countries that are in transition, we've got countries that are under strong authoritarian regimes. So the environments and the contexts are very different. And the challenge that we have is how do we share knowledge that we gain through our inquiry, our research, our curiosity in such a way that policymakers can have a positive impact on both the practitioners and the small businesses globally. Next slide, please. So what is JICSB? It's not really a traditional academic journal. It's a mix. It's a mix of academic research, thought leader articles and challenges. We're using these thought leaders to challenge us on the academic side, to look at the real issues that they're facing both immediately and long term. And I think the environment that we're in today with the coronavirus pandemic is a great example. There's some very short-term issues that micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, large businesses, and societies in general are going to have to deal with, and how we deal with them, how we deal with these issues are going to have longer-term consequences. And so how do we handle all of this? What do we do? The world is changing. I wrote a small piece on what's on the other side because we really don't know. We can look back at other crises and issues that confronted the world. Most recently, the financial crisis of 2008, and what worked then probably is not going to work today. Certainly on the health side. So our objective is to take the research that's being done, but ask our authors and researchers to address the question of, so why is this important? So what? What is this? What's the impact going to be? And how is it going to have an impact? So taking a step beyond just collecting knowledge and coming to conclusions and thinking about, okay, so what further research can we do? Why are we doing it? And ultimately, as we've mentioned before, we want to be able to inform policy and practice and help improve the performance and sustainability of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. So the journal is going to be a mix of thought leader articles, academic research, and case studies. And in fact, the first issue is going to be primarily Thoughtleader articles, and one case study. And of course, as Tom mentioned, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are not just a useful framework, but it clearly identifies some of the problems that need to be solved. The UN would like to have them have significant solutions by 2030. It's probably going to be a longer term effort. And I think most of us know what some of those challenges are. Next slide, please. Tom?
Yes, thanks, Jeff. So it's kind of Jeff was just going through a moment ago, and I mentioned the author pool a bit earlier. You probably could see just how unique the proposition for this journal is, right? And just how wide the spectrum of contributors might be. So you think about the authors for JICSB, they're really going to break down into two categories, right? One is going to be tried and true academic researchers that might be doing something a bit different and trying to reach a policy practitioner audience, right? Or two, you're going to have policymakers and practitioners writing a paper, writing a think piece, as Jeff just mentioned, for maybe an academic audience or an audience of fellow policymakers. And the takeaway there for us at Taylor & Francis is that either way, those authors are going to need to be supported because it's something new and it's a new proposition for them, right? So in conjunction with the ICSB, we're putting together the JICSB author toolkit to make it as seamless and as easy as possible. And there's really three parts to it. One is the author interface itself. So that means a kind of linked up, easy to use peer review site between JICSB and the ICSB's other journal, the Journal of Small Business Management, which was mentioned earlier. So that takes care of that researcher audience that might be used to publishing in JSBM or understand that workflow and that interface a bit better. They're going to be able to use essentially the same system, the same login information, again, to make that as smooth as possible. There's going to be one portal through Taylor & Francis Online to be able to track all submissions between the two journals for authors to make it really simple. So if an author puts together a more kind of broad audience think piece for JICSB, but there's a research component to that same piece that goes in JSBM, you could track both of those very easily and kind of take some of the burden off the idea of thinking about two different audiences. And the third bit is just author support. Jeff and his team have really made that our priority. We have coverage in terms of our support team that I think is something crazy, like 22 hours a day, someone's on the line to get back to these authors if questions and troubleshooting arise. So we try to cover everything to make it as simple as possible. The second bit is the training and tools piece, right? And it really is about, there's obviously the basics that are always there for researchers, but it's about that next level and those 21st century skills. So how do you write a paper for the policy maker and practitioner? How do you engage with the public with your research, which is always a bit of a hurdle because the language is just so different versus the researcher to researcher publications. The what skills researchers need for the future box you'll see right there on the top is a course we put together, and we're taking some steps to tailor that with the ICSB. And you can see a couple other examples down there. The 12-week learning program to develop those skills, something that's free and really easy for authors on both sides of the coin to use to increase their ability to make impact on the other side. And the last bit is the ethics and integrity piece. For anyone who doesn't know, COPE in the bottom right there is the Committee on Publishing Ethics. At Taylor & Francis, we are one of their primary partners, and it is an organization that had been traditionally medically focused for probably obvious reasons, but they've expanded into business and management research recently, and we've been their key partner, and the ICSB and JICSB is our inaugural partner on working with that organization. So there's a lot of new layers to ethics in publishing these days, from data, plagiarism, things like that. We want this journal to be really the gold standard when it comes to that. And it's been great working with the ICSB, Jeff and Iman so far we're planning to roll out a couple of in-person sessions, trainings at some conferences like the Academy of Management, the ICSB World Congress. Obviously in-person events are in flux right now, but it's something we'll come back to when the smoke lifts on the COVID-19 situation, hopefully. But we're putting some resource there to to make it as easy for authors, again, on both sides of the spectrum. Next slide.
Okay, so here's where you can learn more about the Journal of the International Council for Small Business. I would note that the first issue, thank you to Taylor and Francis, will be freely accessible to everybody. You don't have to have a membership in ICSB to see it. Right now, we're targeting 4 online editions, January, April, July, and October. With startup challenges, our first issue is going to be a little bit late, and probably our second issue, the April issue. We're also planning to have print issues that include, for example, January and April articles, and the second one would include the July and October articles. One of our objectives is not just to have this journal available to researchers, but to make it available to policymakers and practitioners as well. And I've always said that, you know, the way you get people's attention, even in this digital age, is to have a copy of the journal sitting in the waiting room of some of these key policymakers. And so that's what the print journals are intended to do. Put them on the desk of the policymaker and practitioners, as well as in their waiting rooms. Plus having it available online, I think will help spread the word. You can contact us at JICSB at ICSB.org, and here is our contact information.
Great, thank you so much. And before we get into the questions, we want to also thank heavily our partners, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. They are our first inaugural partners for this new journal, and also the SME World Forum that just held their Congress in Macau, in which the editor Jeff was there managing some sessions and leading some sessions here. So both our inaugural partners, we want to thank them tremendously for their hard work. So we're going to open up for questions here, and the way it works, on the right hand side you can enter some questions, and then I'll get to ask them the questions that you put in the chat box here. But let me start asking the editor real quick, Jeff, about the vision and the future of JICSB. We're in the midst of a crisis that's happening right here. It's affecting the world. Traditionally, other journals will take a while to put a call out and then have the manuscripts coming in for reviewing. So eventually, if you get something out, it will take maybe 2 years or almost 3 years to get a publication out. How is this new journal moving with the speed of what's going on in the world right now? Maybe you can explain.
Sure. The thought pieces, the thought leader pieces, are a way to address more immediate and global concerns. And so we're actually right now beginning to work on a piece that'll be in our next issue on how countries have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic and what's going on. And that's a moving target. You know, we've got a target of having all of our information put together by May 15th. I'm sure there's going to be some additional initiatives announced after that, but we'll be able to do that and get something out in our next issue. What I'm fascinated with is what's going to happen after we move through this crisis. Right now, there's a conversation about social versus economic priorities. I'm seeing more commentary about the importance of dealing with the human side of society, and how businesses, small businesses in particular, can fill a unique role. Professor Hartman-Meyer yesterday did a webinar, and one of the things that he talked about towards the end of the webinar was maybe rethinking what most of our micro and small businesses roles really are. They're not necessarily for-profit organizations, but rather social enterprises as opposed to business enterprises. And if you think about it, the role that they play in their communities and in their markets, they're certainly much closer to customers. They're much closer to the community that they live in. We may not be able to capture in terms of metrics their involvement completely, but just look around yourself, look around what's happening around you, and particularly in a time of crisis like we have today. You know, we've got we're locked down in the United States. We're supposed to stay home, and yet there are a lot of services and a lot of small businesses that are sticking their necks out to continue to serve their customers. And so this is an opportunity. It may not be short term, but it's certainly an opportunity to think about how we view micro and small, medium-sized enterprises as we move forward, particularly from a social or from a humane entrepreneurship perspective.
One thing that you discussed with me, and we actually discussed with Tom here, is that we have a lot of events. You mentioned earlier, we had an event at OECD in Paris. We have every year our June 27 event at the United Nations. We were planning to do an event with UNCTAD in Geneva in May. We have these events now with our partners that we mentioned earlier here. How do you see this journal, this new journal, integrating with our partners in these events?
Well, first of all, I think the journal provides a voice. So when we have these events, the participants, rather than just talking to each other, have an opportunity to contribute to the journal and have a much broader audience. And I think that's very, very important because and some of the ideas that come out of these conferences are pretty timely. They may not be as thoroughly researched as we might like, but certainly they should be put on the table for consideration and discussion. And so that clearly is a way that JICSB can leverage the knowledge and the conversation that takes place at these events.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'm going to switch to Tom here. But for the first issue, can you please explain or share a little bit the story of how you reached out to Dr. Chantaline Carpentier from UNCTAD and Andrew McDonald from EBRD and asking them to submit pieces to the journal? And what were these type of pieces or articles that they submitted? Maybe you can share a little bit of this so people can see more of the depth of the articles that are coming from our partners, and maybe they can submit as well.
The articles that first of all, we wanted to give proponents of MSMEs an opportunity to share their thoughts and their visions of what we can do through various organizations to support MSMEs. And so as we talked, I mentioned we were involved with OECD's Working Party for Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises. There are a lot of people at those tables twice a year, and in fact that's where we met Andrew McDonald from the European board. And as you talk to people, you realize that there's a lot of stuff going on that is not necessarily being shared. I'm not going to say we're sharing best practices, although ultimately I'm sure we can get to that point. But we're sharing what works and what doesn't work. The International Labor Organization is doing some really, really good work, and of course UNCTAD, the United Nations Office on Trade, and I don't remember the exact title of the organization, but they're responsible primarily for for trade and economics of their countries, and the Sustainable Development Goals is a major piece of their portfolio. And so reaching out to these kinds of organizations, OECD, the United Nations, several offices in the United Nations, the International Labor Organization, all these groups, the European Development Bank, all of these groups are already active in providing policy as well as services practice at the practice level to the MSME community. And so part of the rationale for asking them to provide thought pieces was to help bring them to the table and start this conversation about how we can move forward to improve the lot of MSMEs that ultimately will lift societies.
Thank you. Tom, you proposed this to ICSB for the Academy of Management. You wanted to do a session, and you mentioned a little bit here, once we get back together, when there's more social connections, is that you wanted to have a session with the author, with the editor of JICSB at the Academy of Management, which potential researchers can come in and pitch their ideas. Explain a little bit of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned a bit earlier about how important the events are to the ICSB, but we also view the events as being really important to the journal as well. And it goes back to that voice angle that Jeff mentioned a second ago. But for us as an organization, it's about that author pool, right? It's about bringing that author pool along and having them understand what the journal is all about and getting their contributions kind of on the spot. I think there's probably some people here that have been a part of the traditional meet the editors session at a conference, right? And there's some value in that because you might learn the ABCs, but with a journal like JICSB, going to an event like the Academy of Management and being able to make the connections in terms of, okay, we're trying to address some problems here. We're trying to work within the realm of the SDGs. That really requires a higher level conversation with the editor, maybe with the publisher to some degree, to kind of talk about, okay, how does this process work? What are the challenges we're looking to address? And as Jeff mentioned a moment ago, this is a nimble journal, right? I mean, that's one of the things that attracted us to publishing JICSB, was that it could move quickly, at events or after events to address them on a global scale. So that's what I envisioned at a conference like the Academy of Management, that dialogue to drive the content forward and react to what's happening around the globe.
So saying this, I'm going to put you both now on the spot here. So saying this, we don't know if we're going to meet again in the foreseeable short-term period here. So until we sort this out and figure it all out, the world is getting more together online. So is it possible, and I know I didn't ask you this before, but I'm going to ask you here, is it possible then to pitch the editor of JICSB online? We can schedule a time and do a call out for all our members and our partners worldwide to meet with the editor of JICSB, and maybe Tom with you at some point, right? And to pitch an idea for research or something that they're already working on, and pass it by the editor, say, is this something that JICSB will consider for publication? And if the editor likes it and he shares it with some people, then we say, you get a ticket to submit immediately to JICSB for immediate recognition and processing. Is this something we can do? It's a yes
Absolutely.
or no question.
Absolutely, yes. And we've got a team of global editors in addition to our associate editors who would be willing to participate in those online pitches, and those could be open. Those could be open sessions so that everybody could listen in as well. Doesn't have to be a closed session.
So then, if that's the case, then we should just call it Pitch JICSB and have it ready as soon as we put some dates together where everybody's available. We can do a Pitch JICSB session online for people to come in.
Absolutely.
So saying this, we have a question that came from a colleague from Africa saying, what about research in Africa? Tom, talk a little bit about what we find coming in from Africa in terms of publications and research, if you want to share a little bit of that. I know you mentioned Egypt and how Egypt is important, but there's also all of Africa. So maybe explain a little bit of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can go really in depth there and talk for a while, but I'll pick a couple points off the top that we're seeing as publishers. I mentioned a bit earlier about the global conversation and what JICSB wants to do. And I mentioned Egypt specifically, but there's a couple of reasons why. So one, there's not only an increase in research that we're seeing coming from Egypt, but also Africa more broadly. What we're also seeing is that the reviewer pool, right? So the people that are going to review manuscripts, work with editorial teams, and help make decisions. The pool is growing at the same rate as the research, but the participation of those reviewers from Africa, from Egypt, from places like Turkey as well, isn't growing quite as fast. So what does that tell us? It tells us that editors and editorial board members aren't engaging researchers in Africa that way. And that's one of the things we want to get off the ground right away with JICSB is that, okay, we don't want to just be putting content or publishing things and giving, it's not just about access, it's about engagement. And that also comes to the training piece as well, because there is some challenges there between different institutions, and that goes for any content. It goes for the US just as well, being able to contribute as reviewers. So it's really that gap that we see as publishers that we're trying to address with journals like JICSB and the training and the availability at conferences and things like that. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, and there's a difficult question here, but it's also a good question to ask here, and I'll answer a little bit here, saying the Academy of Management has its own portfolio of journals, and we all know how well is the AOM here. So the question is, how does our journals fit in or engage in with the Academy of Management journal? So I'll answer part of this because I'm actually working with the program chair for the Academy of Management, Dr. Herman Aguinas, and he's actually 2 doors down from me from George Washington University Department of Management. He's the chair there. So the way I say it, it's a rising tide rises all ships, and there's a lot of good ships that are in this ocean. And the Academy of Management has some excellent journals. ICSB has some excellent journals as well. The entrepreneurship division of the Academy are doing some fantastic work with pushing the envelope on research. But it doesn't mean that one is enough. We need many voices to come in, many different voices to come in. And that's, I think, one of the things that ICSB and also the World SME Forum stands for. We're a different voice. We were the first organization in the world to go to the United Nations and saying, where's the voice of micro and small and medium enterprises? We don't see it in your portfolio of discussion. We see you call them private sector, but SMEs and micro SMEs are not just the private sector. They're vital to society. And they listen to us. And Argentina was the first country to come in line and support us and saying, we will take your resolution and we'll move it forward. And a lot of other countries, the United States, a lot of other countries came in and supported us. China supported us on this one. Russia supported us on this one, right? So everybody came. And what we see today is all the world is focusing on SMEs and micro SMEs. How do we sustain them? How do we keep them alive? Because they're playing a critical role in society. That came from ICSB. That came from our focus, our 4 pillars: research, practice, policy, and education. JICSB fits this. Academy does some great work as well. Together, it's 1 + 1 = 11 and not 2. So that's how I'd answer it. Jeff, do you want to jump in and say something more about this?
I do. One of the advantages I think that JICSB has is we're focused on a global perspective. And the reality is traditional academic research may not be the best way to explore phenomena happening in developing parts of the world. It's a different environment. The data is much sparser and it's probably less reliable. And so I think that we can bring, maybe it's through the thought pieces, maybe it's through some research proposals that people want to share, but looking at the world a little bit differently than we traditionally do is going to uncover, I think, some concepts and some facts that will help better inform our policymakers. And so, there's a very traditional way of doing research, academic research, and there's a more pragmatic way of doing it when you're working for NGOs and government organizations, and someplace in the middle, how we define, how we frame issues is going to inform how we make better decisions going forward.
Good. And one more thing I want to ask Tom here. Taylor and Francis, can you talk a little bit about the different portfolio of journals you have and how this all integrates together?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned a bit earlier that Taylor and Francis is the largest publisher in the social sciences, and what that comes with is a tremendous kind of breadth and depth to the journals we publish in management, entrepreneurship, and some related small business. We publish the journal of 2 ICSB affiliates in Australia and in Canada. So there's a really nice kind of lineup there that works in tandem to cover the scope of research. But we also are going to put that alongside more kind of general management type titles, and even titles that kind of are focused on development. We have an African management journal. We have development studies journals that focus on SMEs to some degree in the developing world. So there's a really kind of nice, it's kind of a good, not competition, but peripherally related. They kind of feed into each other and put some real strength together on that list. And so we think there's kind of a lot of kind of opportunity there for kind of collaboration to bring readers together, and kind of, again, just push the content out that's going to be to new audiences.
Great. There's one more question and I'll wrap it up. The question is, can you give some more information on the structure of the articles expected? Is it the same configuration as a traditional article, or do you have something else in mind? Jeff?
For a traditional academic research paper, we would expect the same kind of format. The only difference is going to be those 3 questions that I mentioned before. What's the relevance? The why, the what, and the how. It's one of the funding organizations for an affiliate of the ICSB kept harping on so what. So what does all this research mean? What is it? What's the impact? How's it going to make a difference? We need to see in maybe not a separate section, but certainly in the conclusions, a clear indication of why the research is important and what the impact is going to be.
Great. So I want to mention one thing, and then I'll leave you both to say your last 2 statements here. JICSB is the bridge between multinational organizations that are doing major research, academia, private sector, and the public sector. We are the bridge that connects everybody. We as a nonprofit are basically open to all viewpoints. We don't advocate for one specific viewpoint. We are the platform to bring everybody together. And that's really the magic that this journal has than many other journals here. Everybody can submit. And I'll give you an example of this. Just last week, talking to Jeff, we reached out to the ILO, and they're working on a paper for us to submit. We reached out to UNCTAD. We reached out to OECD. We reached out to many organizations, and we called them as ICSB and said, listen, this is happening. We need something for you to send us immediately. They're working on their flagship reports, but every answer we got, we hear you, ICSB, we'll get you something ASAP to put in your reports, because it's important. Because they know we're collecting the voices of everybody coming together. That's the value proposition of this new journal. What we see happening in the future, that this journal will sit in a lot of decision makers' tables and desks and saying, look what JICSB is saying. This is coming from the International Council for Small Business. They're a global nonprofit organization supporting every partner to come in with some research. That's what I'm excited about. I'll give it to Tom, and then Jeff will end the session. Tom?
Yeah, just real quick to say thanks very much to Ayman and Jeff for letting me participate in not just this session, but really the ability to work on JICSB and with the ICSB. And I'll just kind of echo some of Ayman's statements in closing, is that, there's where publishing is right now, there's where journals is right now, and there's where it's going to be, and JICSB is where it's going to be. And that comes from the funder level, the university level, the policy level, they're all feeling out there for ways to put information out and absorb new information to help guide them on MSME policy, practice, and research. And this journal is perfectly positioned to do that, and we are really excited to be a part of it. My email is in the slide, and I encourage anybody, any questions on the publishing side of things, I'd be happy to engage over email. And with that, I will pass it over to Jeff for the closing.
Thank you, Tom. And I think I'll just close by paraphrasing a comment that I've heard from two of our partners, and that is, it's about time we had something that focuses the way JICSB is going to focus. They're very, very excited. Most organizations, as I'm sure we recognize, tend not to, how shall I put it, open their kimonos. They're very insular, and so having a means, a platform for sharing ideas, for sharing research, for sharing data is really, really important to them. And in fact, since we began promoting the journal, we've had several of these partner organizations begin talking to one another about sharing data. And I think that's really, really important as we look to help meet the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, but also about improving the performance and sustainability of our micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise community globally. We've got so many of those businesses out there that just think, if you can improve their performance by 5%, think of how many more young people would finish their education. Think about the improvement in the standard of living. And I'm talking primarily about some of the less developed parts of the world. It can have a huge impact if we can communicate effectively and help facilitate moving knowledge down the pipeline through the policymakers and practitioners to the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprise community worldwide.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jeff. And with that, we end this session. But I want to tell you how excited I am to announce that on Monday, March 30th, we have our partners, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, the same time at 6 p.m. with Dr. Donna Kelly and Dr. Niels Bosma from GEM, the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, to come and talk about their report, their flagship report, their annual report, to come and talk about the report of it, the executive report, if you may, and also talk about the current situation that's happening here. We were just in Miami when they announced their report. We called them up, as we did many other partners, and we said, we please need you to come here and talk about what you all are doing and how you're supporting entrepreneurship worldwide, and they were delighted to join us. So we are just excited to have them on Monday, March 30th at 6 p.m. And also we are extremely delighted as well, as with Jim, to welcome UNCTAD, the United Nations, and Dr. Chanteline Carpentier on Tuesday, the 31st of March at 6 p.m. as well, to come and talk about the work that UNCTAD is doing in supporting micro and small medium enterprises. We'll be sharing this information out to everybody. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Stay safe, and we talk again soon. Thank you, everybody.